Let's talk about my 5 favorite whiskeys of 2023 from the Great White North. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey on the West Coast. My name is Matt, and today we're going to be talking about my top 5 Canadian whiskeys of 2023. Now, on this list, you're going to really notice a slant towards Western Canadian distilleries and Western Canadian whiskeys. And why not? This is Whiskey on the West Coast. I put in a real concerted effort into trying to get to know more West Coast whiskeys and distilleries this year. Since I only have a finite amount of money to be purchasing whiskeys with, I had to put my money one direction, and that was towards the West Coast when it came to Canadian whiskeys. And it's not to say there isn't great whiskeys in other parts of Canada that I'd love to try. It's just these are the ones that I actually got to try this year. These are the best of the ones I got to try this year. It is important to mention that even if they don't sell these whiskeys in places like the SAQ or the LCBO, to my knowledge, each of these distilleries does ship across Canada. And so if you're in Canada, you should be able to order directly from these distilleries. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below. Without further ado, let's get to the list. Number 5 on this list is coming from a relatively unknown distillery, I think, amongst a lot of whiskey lovers, and that is Legend Distilling out of Naramata, British Columbia. Now, I visited the distillery earlier this summer and really enjoyed my visit, and that's when I actually purchased this whiskey after I tried it at the distillery. It's at 46% ABV, it's non-chill filtered, it's natural color, it runs about $85 Canadian for a bottle. However, the bottle is a bit smaller than you might be used to. It's about 500 milliliters. Now, this whiskey is actually made up of a combination of 75% BC grown wheat, 25% BC grown rye. It's all grown near Dawson Creek, British Columbia, quite far north, honestly, for the province itself. Now, these grains are both mashed and fermented together for this whiskey, so they're not made separately like a lot of Canadian whiskeys are. They'll do the rye separate, the corn separate, the wheat separate. No, these were done together. Now, they took portions of 10 different French oak casks that had already previously held cherry fortified wine in them before. So that's really interesting. So basically cherry port casks, let's say, for lack of a better term. And these casks, there was 2 of them from 2015, there was 6 from 2016, and there was 2 from 2018. So most of this whiskey is either 7 or 8-year-old Canadian whiskey. Now, what's really cool to note is that this is a bloody explosive nose and a absolutely jammy palate with a lovely rye backbone. I was blown away by it. I'm really enjoying this whiskey so far, and I've been sharing it with anyone who will drink rye. I have a lot of friends who are single malt lovers. This is a phenomenal Canadian whiskey. I think why it needs Legend Distilling needs a lot more attention. There was only 180 bottles of this whiskey made, and there's still some available on the website. They do ship across Canada, so if you're looking for a bottle, you should be able to pick it up on their website. Number 4 on this list is coming from Odd Society Spirits in East Vancouver. Now, this is their 10th anniversary bottling. It's called the Boneyard. And there's a good reason why it's called the Boneyard, but this is $78 Canadian is what this costs. It's 46% ABV, it's not chill filtered, it's natural color, and they're kind of a pretty experimental little distillery. And I think the name is quite fitting, Odd Society, when you consider that. This Boneyard releases their own odd take on the Solera method. So what they do is they take a portion of each bottling run that they do, and they put a little bit in their own special Boneyard casks. So they keep adding to these Boneyard casks, and for their 10th anniversary, they did a bottling of these Boneyard casks. So because they're 10 years old, their first whiskey had to be 3 years old before they bottled it. So all the whiskey in this bottle here is somewhere between 4 to 7 years old, the oldest being 7 years old. Now, what does Odd Society make? Well, they make a lot of single malts with their Commodore single malt. They make a lot of rye with their Prospector rye, and both are really great. They also have some more different things like a maple syrup cask rye and a maple syrup cask Canadian whiskey, as well as a lot of peated experiments. They've used Scottish peat from, I believe, Baird's Maltings. They've used Washington peat as well. But one of the ways they actually incorporate peat and other smoked malts into their whiskeys is by using a gin basket attachment to their stills, to their distilling setup. The reason why they have to do this is because as a craft distiller in BC, they have to use 100% BC grains, BC materials. And the only place nearby that actually produces peated malt or smoked malts, I believe, was Skagit Valley Maltings in Washington State. And so, for instance, in this release over to the left here, Smoke and Oak, this is their Rauch malt. So it's kind of like a beechwood smoked malt. There is some of this in the Boneyard, as well as a Washington State peated one, but they couldn't actually make the whiskey directly with that malt. They had to use it almost as if like it's a flavoring agent in the whiskey through that gin basket. Really cool idea, really cool workaround to get around these rules around being a craft distillery in BC. This whiskey here has a really strong rye note on the nose. The rye backbone on it is fairly great, but you get a lot of that kind of like hickory smoke. You get a nice like fuzzy like sour peach ring candy note. There's a lot of really fantastic different flavors in this, as well as like a sweet maple syrup taste. And maybe because I know it's in there, I look for it, but I had it at the distillery. I knew I had to have a bottle. I've cracked this one open. I had a little bit last night, and I'm just really enjoying this. A little bit more about Odd Society. Their master distiller, Gordon, he studied distilling at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. And then after that, he spent a week studying at the Springbank School in Campbelltown. So, I mean, as a whiskey nerd, a whiskey geek, it's nice to know that he has this real focus on just whiskey enthusiasm, wanting to learn as much as he can about how others run. And I think Odd Society is in good hands, and I cannot wait to see what they do next. My number 4 whiskey of the year was this Boneyard from Odd Society. Number 3 on this list is coming from two brewers from Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. It's their innovative release number 40, bottled at 43% ABV. It's non-chill filtered and natural colored as far as I know, and it runs about $132 Canadian directly from the distillery website. Now, what makes this innovative? Well, Two Brewers is really known for their use of roasted malts in making their whiskey, which is more commonly seen in, say, brewing beer. However, they stepped into a different world of brewing this time. Coffee brewing. What they did is they took whiskey barrels and they filled them with fresh green coffee beans. They let them rest in there for quite a while. They emptied them and then they filled the casks with whiskey. Now, when I heard about this, I thought this was kind of a gimmick. I thought it wouldn't really transfer over. Well, when I tried this whiskey, my mind was absolutely blown away by how much coffee influence you get off the nose immediately. And when I tasted it, it was so oily, it was so viscous, and so clearly roasted coffee, as well as a whole bunch of toasted oak and everything else in it. It was phenomenal. It absolutely blew my mind that this whiskey had just simply been from a barrel that had coffee beans rested in it, and it didn't have any coffee added to it. It was incredible. I really loved this whiskey. It really opened up my eyes to some of the opportunities we have here in Canada when we're not held to such standards like the SWA does with what types of casks they use in Scotland to make their whiskey. So this is a phenomenal whiskey, and I have to say, this is the first whiskey that Kyla ever tried and absolutely loved. So this has Kyla's stamp of approval as well. So number 3 on this list is the Two Brewers innovative release number 40. Number 2 on this list is a really important whiskey, I think. It's actually one of the most important whiskeys that's come out in Canada this year, and it's one of the most innovative. And actually, I'm really not talking about just one whiskey. I am talking about 2, and I'll tell you which one of them is my favorite, and that one will be the one that we officially assign as my number 2 Canadian whiskey of the year. But I want to talk to you about them because they're really important. And these are from McAloney's Canadian Island Distillery, and these are the McAloney's Canadian Island peated single malt Peat Project single cask series releases. Now, what is so special about these? Well, these are whiskeys that are made on Vancouver Island in Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and they're made using relatively local peat sources. They're not made using peat malt imported from Scotland. Now, it's not coming from British Columbia, but it's coming from really close by, nearby the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And it's actually coming from the same peat source that Westland sourced their malt from for their Solemn release, and Copperworks sources for their Washington peated releases. Now, what they've done here, instead of having their malt kilned over at Skagit Valley Maltings, where those distilleries had it done. They actually sourced the peat, they brought it up to Victoria to the distillery, and they used their own peat smoker to peat their own malted barley. And they used 100%, I believe, BC grown malted barley as well. Now, they were able to get their phenol measurements quite a lot higher. These whiskeys measure in at 54 phenol parts per million, which would definitely classify them as heavily peated single malt Canadian whiskeys. Now, there's two releases, as I mentioned, that I want to talk about here. They're both bottled at 46% ABV. They're non-chill filtered. They're natural color. They run somewhere between $110 to $130 Canadian. One is matured in a European Moscatel Barrique. So that's a type of white wine cask. And the other one is Portuguese red wine shaved toast recharred cask. Now, I will tell you that the Portuguese red wine STR cask version was a lot more approachable. It was probably more drinkable of the two. And it had a lot of tones like Coca-Cola, leather, and earthy peat, maple syrup, a lot of sweetness. And the peat, you really had to chew through the whiskey on the palate to pick up the peat, much more subtle on the nose. But the European Moscatel Barrique cask, that was vibrant, heavy, ashy peat on the nose. It was extremely visceral how much more peat it seemed you got on that one as opposed to the other. On the palate, it was almost like a steak char on the outside of the steak that I was getting. There was big peat smoke. It was notes of melon, green apple, and honestly, it reminded me a lot of a whiskey like Lagavulin 8-year-old. And this is probably a 3-year-old whiskey that I'm talking about here. It was really, really impressive. And so the one that I want to highlight is the one that really showed more of that peat influence, that peat terroir. You could pick more up on the nose and the palate, and that would be the European Moscatel release. I think these are really important whiskeys. I can't wait to see what they do next. I have heard that they're going to be working with British Columbia peat in the future as well. So I am really excited about McIlhenny's Island Distillery and what they're doing with locally sourced peat. I think this is really important. I think this is the wave for the future of Canadian single malt whiskey. I wanted to make a quick honorable mention here, and this bottle might look very familiar to what you just saw, but just slightly different in name. That's because this is the old name for the McIlhenny's Island Distillery, which is McIlhenny's Caledonian, which is what it was called before the SWA lawsuit. Now, this whiskey is there in Vernahaven, and this is actually a cask strength small batch version of it. Now, this came out for the 2022 BC Spirits release in November of 2022. I only picked it up in 2023. And as you can see, this is probably the darkest whiskey that I've seen all year and I've tasted all year. It might be the darkest whiskey I've ever had. Now, this is non-chill filtered. It's natural color. It ran me $115 Canadian. It's bottled at 58% ABV, and this is batch 3. Now, there was only 331 bottles of this. This is bottle 206. And again, it's one of the darkest whiskeys I've ever seen in my life. Rob from Whiskey in the Six recently released a review of this exact batch and this whiskey. So if you want more information on it, go ahead, check out his video. I really enjoyed it so far, but I'm still trying to unlock the perfect drinking strength by adding water to this. I believe it takes a lot of water to try and find that. And sometimes I go past it. Sometimes I think I can get it just perfectly. I've really enjoyed trying to find and unlock the mysteries of this whiskey. It is a straight up sherry bomb made from Oloroso sherry casks and Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. I think they're using really quality casks at McIlhenny's. I'm really excited to see what else they come out with in the future, especially when they get a bit more age to it, a bit more refinement. But this whiskey, it's a really fun sherry bomb. I'm really excited about this distillery. They have changed the name of the distillery. I believe they changed the name of this release, but if you check their website and you're looking for something similar to this, very similar, they have a release now called the Cathnahaven or Cathnahaven. And there's a cask strength and a 46% ABV version of this. I think that's the new name for this release. It's the same cask types, Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso sherry casks. It looks seemingly identical. Check out their website for that release if you're looking to pick up a bottle of this, as I believe this is now sold out. Before we get to number 1 on this list, I just want to thank you for watching this far. I really appreciate all the support on the channel. It's been a fantastic year in 2023. And if you can like, share, subscribe if you haven't already, consider becoming a Patreon member with the Whiskey on the West Coast Patreon. But the big thing I want to ask is, can you comment down below what was your favorite Canadian whiskey of the year? I'd love to hear what you guys tried, because I can only try so many whiskeys and I learned so much from you guys. I'd really appreciate you letting me know what you enjoyed this year. Let's get to number 1. My number 1 Canadian whiskey of 2023 may not be a shock to those of you who watched my review of this whiskey, and it is the Shelter Point 10-year-old 2023 batch. It's bottled at 46% ABV, non-chilled, filtered, natural color, which all of these whiskeys have had this integrity approach to presentation, which I'm really excited to see Canadian distilleries embracing this approach. It runs about $120 Canadian. It's coming from Vancouver Island, Campbell River, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and it's made from 100% malted barley grown in British Columbia. Now, some things to know about Shelter Point. They started making whiskey in 2011. They used long fermentations to get a lot more fruity esters out of their whiskey, and they're using traditional Forsyth's copper pot stills. So this is very much along the lines of a traditional, almost like single malt Scotch whiskey. And this whiskey profiles a lot like a Highland single malt Scotch whiskey to me. They use ex-bourbon barrels for the Shelter Point 10-year-old release, and this batch is everything I hoped Shelter Point could grow into. Any sort of off notes or flavors that I wasn't a fan of in their younger batches from 2017 of their artisanal single malt, they've been rounded off, they've been removed, which is one of those wonderful things about cask maturation. Casks add a lot of flavors, but they also take away a lot of flavors that you don't want to have. And that's what we've had happen in 10 years of aging up in Campbell River. What is left behind is a lovely, sweet, coastal, fruity dessert dram with just the slightest whisper of smoke, which is just bloody wonderful. I really love this whiskey. I have the 12-year-old on deck to try next, and I can't wait to see what this whiskey comes out with in the next 5 to 10 years. Maybe we'll see a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old down the road. All I know is that Shelter Point is doing fantastic stuff, and I think they're going to be able to bring us more great whiskey in the future. Well, that's it, guys. That's the list. Those are my top 5 Canadian whiskeys of 2023. Again, let me know down in the comments below, what was your favorite whiskey from Canada in 2023? Until next time, from the West Coast, Slàinte.